Hey guys, Trafotin here. How was your week? Let me know down in the comments below, because my week was awful and I had to reinstall my entire system from scratch. And it's really forced me to take a step back and reevaluate my poor life decisions, like totally breaking my system. The result of this has caused me to create my own build script, which shockingly enough I haven't done until this year, which has basically allowed me to build my entire system from scratch. And I am going to risk sharing it with the world and being flooded with complaints about how my script broke your computer on GitLab. I'll show you exactly what I did, how you can tweak it to your liking, and copy my setup in less than 20 minutes. A couple weeks ago, I was experimenting with some tweaks that I firmly believe everyone should be doing, and I tested all of them on myself as a guinea pig instead of you. I've run the following system on my capture computer for a couple of months now, and I believe now is the right time to unveil this given what has happened to me over the last couple of weeks. First, I want to explain why I chose Fedora to begin with. Fedora is the cutting edge of the Linux desktop and has been dead set on revolutionizing major standards in the Linux desktop as we know it. Fedora has been where I've stayed for years because of its push for innovation in the desktop space and very strong defaults. However, I do also want to clarify that while the defaults are generally pretty good and their best practices are really great, from what I've seen, it never feels like enough, because whenever I read about something online or the more I learn about anything, the more bitter and boomer I become, and it takes off 2 decades of my life. The only reason I have stuck around to use Linux as long as I have is because the privacy situation with Windows and macOS is so oppressive, and I want to use a system that isn't constantly breathing over my neck and collecting telemetry. And I also have some little comments in there that give a brief helping hand, but this video is going to be the primary way that I'm going to show what's actually happening here. Typically, what I do is I start with Fedora's default workstation edition as a base. My installer was primarily designed to be on Fedora workstation first, and branches out from there. I have plans to extend my script to the other Fedora spins, but only if you use Wayland, because I can't endorse using X11. X11 is unalived, and we need to be using Fedora with Wayland. The other thing that I also want to touch on is I am but a lowly NVIDIA user who has to suffer through the random and arbitrary changes that NVIDIA makes to their proprietary driver, and no, I don't have an Ampere GPU, so I have to deal with all of NVIDIA's nonsense. I've created a script to give me the kernel signing for secure boot and to use proprietary NVIDIA drivers. It's the same script from the last video, and that's exactly what I used. And the last thing I also did was enable full disk encryption. Now I know there's some hubbub about Fedora's new web UI installer and how bad Fedora's current installer is, but do you want to know a problem that exists in both Fedora? Is old and new installer, which I'm pretty sure they're changing. It doesn't enable or strong arm users into enabling full disk encryption. Now, I know it's really easy to set up, but as of now, it burdens the end user with seeking out this option themselves rather than forcing them to enable it by default and disabling it if they don't want it. This full disk encryption prevents someone from just booting in with another Linux USB or seizing your device, pulling out your hard drive, and reading all of your files. And sure, this results in you having to enter in a second password, but this should be done for everyone. No exceptions. I am taking no chances. Even the performance impact is minimal. Just do it already. After installing Fedora, I proceed through the installation, disabling location services and the abort bug reporting. Other than this, I don't enable any additional repos and I don't change anything else. From here, you can actually open a terminal and download or git clone my script to get started and just give it a run. If If you go to your downloads folder where you probably downloaded your script, you go type in a chmod +x my script, and then you go to a /my script. You can give it a run, but if you would like to open it in a text editor, you can go and do that if you would like to make changes. And the script has also only been written for Fedora Workstation. So if you're using one of the other spins of Fedora, like say you're using Fedora's KDE spin, or using the immutable spins, or using Fedora with Sway, this will not work and will probably cause you more issues. So don't run this if you're running one of the other spins. The first change that I made, which you could apply to any Fedora spin that isn't immutable, is improvements to the DNF package manager. DNF is configured to choose the fastest mirror based on your IP address. This results in faster downloads because DNF will now seek a server closer to you. DNF can also do parallel downloads, where it will try to download multiple files at once rather than downloading each package individually one at a time. But the default setting of parallel downloads is at only 3 files at a time. If you change this to 10, it bumps up the update speed as long as your connection can support it. And finally, DNF has telemetry to count the number of Fedora users. Now, before the privacy-minded people in the audience get all up in arms, I say to you, this is not enabled by default. It is disabled. But I added it to my DNF config just to be safe. The next thing I do after adjusting DNF is we start to rip out some of the applications that are pre-installed into Fedora Workstation by default. And I mean a lot of them. The first is I uninstalled a lot of firmware for various hardware that you probably don't have. Now, before you don't worry, no, I didn't remove NVIDIA or AMD or Intel anything. But I did remove some of the other stuff. And then typically it's stuff for like audio software or chipsets you might not even have. I don't think anyone's going to be using a Marvell chips on their desktop computer anytime soon, yet it's included in the default install of Fedora. The other thing I did was I removed the Anaconda installer. You remember that installer we just clicked through to get all of those options? They don't remove it. Disgusting. Get rid of it. Now, I also uninstalled a lot of the core GNOME applications, but I replaced them with their Flatpak equivalents. And this also isn't just the GNOME applications, but some of the pre-built-in applications too, like Firefox, for example. If you use the Flatpak of Firefox, it removes the middlemen Fedora package managers. And I mean no offense to Fedora's package managers, but I feel like it's just duplicating work when Mozilla's Flatpak Firefox package is the official package. And the same is true of GNOME, because GNOME is the official publisher of most of their GUI suite because it all works in Flatpak. And I did list a lot of options here, so do not just blindly copy paste what I have in here. Test this out in a virtual machine first, and please check out every single package and see if it is something you want or need. Now, once you've uninstalled all of the applications you don't need, let's update our system to the most we possibly can and get all of the things that are totally up to date. So the first thing you do is you do a sudo DNF upgrade. If you add a -y command at the end, that includes auto agreeing to the prompt for you. And when you first install your system, you're gonna want to install updates because you have to play catch up on the time between when the ISO was first released and the updates, which are released continuously every single day. And once we've fully updated the system, we want to install any firmware updates. And this is where we use the Firmware Update Manager. The Firmware Update Manager is part of the Linux Vendor Firmware Service, which provides updates from some of the biggest firmware manufacturers in the world, like HP and Lenovo and Dell. And we want to get these updates because in some cases, it's the only way we can get firmware updates on Linux, as long as your device is supported by your manufacturer, unless you're me and you have a computer that was made 8 years ago. And once you've installed all of your DNF updates and all of your firmware updates, then we're going to add a repository. And the repositories that we're going to add are going to be the stuff to help fill in the missing gaps of our system that we don't have out of the box. And the first thing that we're going to install is FlatHub. Now hold up for a minute. All over the internet, you'll hear news about Fedora's unfiltered flat hub. And I scoff at this as a normal user because I was unable to install any of the promised unfiltered proprietary applications from FlatHub. I tested this with a fresh ISO of Fedora 38, and yes, I did this before and after fully updating the system, and both times it failed. I don't know what's going on in Fedora land in detail, but saying that you're shipping an unfiltered FlatHub when I can't even install Discord or Spotify, which are just random one-off tests I did, just comes off as really dishonest if I can't install any proprietary FlatHub only application, anything. Now, you also have to double on top of this that there's conflict in the world of FlatHub because Uncle Sam doesn't appreciate his US-based companies packaging proprietary codecs owned by the MPAA. Additionally, if you want to go watch your anime, you're going to need to install RPM Fusion, which will give you access to some of the more non-free codecs and drivers that once again are limited because of those pesky US copyright holders. Those pesky copyright holders couldn't go to France and sequester RPM Fusion since it's completely unofficial from the US-based Fedora. I also try to do some extra things to help fill in my own personal things. So for example, one of the things that I do is I enable virtualization. And again, you have to go in your BIOS and enable virtualization, but I auto set up Virt Manager because Fedora has a group package where it's sudo dnf install at virtualization, and this will automatically set up Virt Manager and all of its dependencies and everything you need, and you just need to enable the systemd service and add yourself to the group and just do a sudo systemctl start and you're done and you're there. But the final thing that I try to do that I think is something that I think more users will experience, and especially because of the Gen Zers out there, is I disable Bluetooth. And if you use Bluetooth, you're gonna want to delete this line. I don't use Bluetooth anything, so I flat out disabled Bluetooth. And so far, everything I've talked about is stuff you can see pretty clearly, but I've also tried to implement some security hardening, which I have dug around from the recesses of the internet, and I'm going to introduce some of this now. The first thing I did was change the default UMask to 077. What this does is it changes the user permissions so that the root user and regular users are only ones that are allowed to enter new directories and read and edit files, which prevents other users on your computer from snooping on your files. Now, the second thing that I did was I enabled KickSecure's kernel hardening, and this is probably the most impactful under the hood change of my script. Longtime viewers of my channel might recall that I previously did a video on the virtual machine-based Linux distribution Whonix, and Whonix is based off of a fork of Debian called KickSecure, which totally privacy and security hardens Debian to the best of its abilities. However, I'm not content on daily driving KickSecure because it's based off of Debian, and honestly, some of the changes that they make are too much for my needs and have negative impact on some high-performance things, like, say, the literal medium I communicate you through, because this is technically through Wine, and that is impacted through KickSecure's changes. However, in an effort to have my cake and eat it too, I have identified the following patches that have very little impact on daily usage, and I have been running them on all of my computers for months now, and the impact is practically non-existent and makes your security better in the process, so why turn it down? And if there are gamers out there worried about the tiny, little, minute frames that are being taken away by this kernel hardening, don't worry, because my gaming video was created and edited with these patches. And in addition, I've also added more patches to systemd, because clearly after my own heart, the next set of patches comes from Divested Computing and their spin of Fedora. And if Divested Computing sounds familiar to you, you might have heard of their Android ROM, DivestOS, which is a security-hardened fork of LineageOS, which actually adds in verified boot and a locked root account, which normal LineageOS doesn't have. Divested's patches that I included here are specifically hardening for systemd modules, which they collectively call brace. Now, I haven't investigated every patch, and I'm actually trying to go through and filter some of the patches that they have, because if you go to their GitLab page or their GitHub repo, you'll see that they've got a ton more. And they actually also have a Fedora repo, which I am working on, so I can find out what works and what doesn't. And I'll get back to you guys in another video when all of this is over and done with. Did you know that it's not just Fedora, but Windows, Mac, and Linux distributions use NTP to get the time? But what if I told you that NTP has no authentication about getting your time at all? And this is where NTS comes in. If NTP stands for the Network Time Protocol, NTS is Network Time Security and actually provides robust authentication to the time and verifies that the time is correct with proper servers. GrapheneOS's architecture provides a configuration that is completely compatible with Fedora and adds an extra thing as a cron job to change how NTS works on your device. And it might be a little different based on your location, and you can probably change the servers here, but these are the defaults that are in GrapheneOS's. The other thing that I did was I removed FirewallD's open ports. Now, by default, FirewallD actually has a lot of default rules and services, but I don't think most users ever intend on playing the game of figuring out what port they need to open. Of course, you're welcome to add your own or even choose if you want to leave these enabled, but I will tell you, if you disable the SSH rule, I'm still able to connect to my own server over SSH, so it clearly works fine, and I'm able to connect to my GitLab just fine. The last thing I did was I added some special mitigations to block passive network monitoring services. Now, when I say this, I mean when you connect to a network, the IT department or the owner of the network might have the ability to passively track your device as it goes throughout a network. So one of the things I did was you can change this by making it so that your device has a random MAC address. So you need to randomize your MAC address, even though it doesn't do a whole lot. It's helpful because it makes it harder for your device to be tracked within a network. And yes, this still applies if you use Ethernet, even though I am the only one in my home right now. And that is pretty much it. If you like my script, you can download and modify it yourself. And don't worry, if you're like me and use NVIDIA, you've probably realized that NVIDIA's drivers perform so inconsistently after using Fedora Workstation for 2 weeks that you changed back to KDE to test this whole new Polonium thing. Didn't Niccolo make a video about that? Shut up! Be quiet and support my sunk time fallacy. Anyway, why don't you go leave a like on this video? Leave a like on this video if you want NVIDIA to stop using EGL streams so I can use a WL Roots window manager like everyone who doesn't use NVIDIA. And subscribe if you would like to see more scripting content, as well as the massive list of goals that I have to include install scripts for. Thank you for watching. I will see you all next time, and I hope not to see too many complaints on the GitLab.